Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. May all the peace and blessings of the Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be on all of us. Now today, as you can see, I want us, as I told you in the previous lesson, I want us to dive and navigate through the kidney nephron. As you can see, this is the structure of a kidney nephron. Previously, we discussed the urinary system. We have seen the two kidneys, the ureter, urinary bladder, and finally the urethra. Again, we said the kidney was having a basic functional unit that was called the nephron. And therefore, this is the basic functional unit of the kidney known as the kidney nephron. And this is the kidney nephron, the functional unit of the kidney known as the kidney nephron. Now, without wasting time, we said that the kidney was being supplied by the renal artery. And therefore, we are going to see that the renal artery will now branch further to supply the kidney nephron. Again, the renal artery that you are having is going to branch into afferent arteriole and efferent arteriole. Very good. Now, what are the components of a kidney nephron? Basically, as you can see here, these are just the blood vessels that supply. Now, the main components of a kidney nephron class basically starts with the first one, that is the glomerulus. Now, the glomerulus is enclosed by a cup-shaped structure known as the Bowman's capsule. Again, you can see a coiled tubule here. It is known as the proximal convoluted tubule. Again, we have a U-shaped tube. It's both having a descending limb and an ascending limb. And therefore, collectively, this one is called the loop of Henle. This one is the descending loop of Henle, and this one is the ascending loop of Henle. Now, the next part is this one. It's called the distal convoluted tubule. And lastly, we have the collecting duct. Now, again, in addition to that, we can see you have the blood vessels running throughout the nephron. And we are going to see what is happening and what is reabsorbed and what is filtered out of the blood and forms the glomerular filtrate. Now, let's do it in steps. Now, the first thing is the kidney is supplied with blood by the renal artery. Now, the renal artery class branches from the dorsal aorta. Why? We said that the kidney is located on the dorsal part of the body, in the dorsal cavity, around in the lumbar region. Now, being located in the dorsal cavity of the body, therefore, it has to be supplied by the dorsal artery. Now, the dorsal artery branches. Now, the renal artery branches from the dorsal aorta. Again, what happens? Now, this one, the renal artery, again, further branches into afferent arteriole and efferent arteriole. Now, what is the relationship between these two arterioles? Like you say, the afferent arteriole is wider than the efferent arteriole. I tried to demonstrate like this, where I made this one very narrow and this one a little bit wider in comparison of the two. Good. Now, we can see that the efferent arteriole is less wide, is narrower as compared to the afferent arteriole. Now, what happens? Number one, the difference in the diameter of the two arterioles will bring a pressure buildup. It will also bring resistance to blood flow. Now, pressure buildup basically happens here for given two reasons. Reason number one is that the efferent arteriole is narrower as compared to the afferent arteriole, therefore bringing about high pressure buildup. Point number two is that this one afferent arteriole branches from the dorsal aorta, renal artery to the dorsal aorta, which is under high pressure. As we know that the aorta carries blood under high pressure simply because it pumps blood to a longer distance, to longer distant tissues and organs. And therefore, this being a branch of the dorsal aorta is therefore said to be under high pressure. Now, let's go next. Now, the blood that reaches the kidney contains what? It contains the following. It contains the urea. It contains dissolved food substances. It contains plasma, proteins, mineral ions, hormones, and oxygen. Now, this is the blood, this one collectively, this black you're seeing here are the blood capillaries. Now, what do they do? Now, this afferent arteriole is containing all these, the urea, dissolved food substances, plasma, proteins, mineral ions, hormones, and oxygen. Very good. Now, once blood reaches the glomerulus, because it is the afferent arteriole that branches into the glomerulus. Now, what happens in the glomerulus? Now, in glomerulus class, what happens is called the ultrafiltration. What is ultrafiltration again? It is the process where substances of low molecular sizes passes or diffuses across or passes from the blood capillaries into the glomerulus. What are those substances of low molecular sizes that enters into the glomerulus to form the glomerular filtrate? Now, those substances include the glucose, amino acid, vitamins, urea, mineral ions. Very good. Those are the substances that will filter out of the blood into the glomerulus to form the glomerular filtrate. And the process is called the ultrafiltration. Let's continue. From there again, what happens? Now, the blood in now the efferent arteriole, what does it contain? It contains plasma proteins. It also contains plasma proteins, and it also contains substances of large molecular sizes that cannot filter out of the blood. Good. Again, the glomerular filtrate moves down the tube into the proximal convoluted tubule. Now, what happens in the proximal convoluted tubule? Now, listen. In the proximal convoluted tubule, all glucose, amino acids, vitamins, and mineral ions are reabsorbed, and some water are reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. Now, substances like urea will not be filtered from the will not be taken back to the bloodstream. Now, here we said in the proximal convoluted tubule class, substances like vitamins, glucose, amino acids, and substances that are useful to the body, cells, and tissues are reabsorbed back. Very good. Now, from there, what happens? The tube continues down the descending loop of Henle. Now, what happens in the descending loop of Henle? Before we go to the descending loop of Henle class, two things happen. The absorption of mineral ions can take place through diffusion as well active transport. And we are going to see one of the adaptations of the proximal convoluted tubule is that it has the mitochondria that provides energy in form of ATP that is needed for the process of active transport. And therefore, the absorption of mineral ions can either be active transport or rather diffusion depending on the concentration between the two mediums. Good. Now, the next thing is about water reabsorption at the proximal convoluted tubule. Principally, water is only reabsorbed through one way, that is osmosis. Now, descending loop of Henle. In the descending loop of Henle, what happens? Primarily, in the descending loop of Henle, what happens is the reabsorption of water. Because the medulla of the kidney has high salt concentration, and therefore, water is highly reabsorbed to minimize to balance the concentration between the two mediums. Now, after the descending loop of Henle, we go to the ascending loop of Henle. What happens at the ascending loop of Henle? Although there's some slight, but principally here, what happens is that there is absorption of mineral ions. Reabsorption of mineral ions. Now, and finally, blood flows to the distal convoluted tubule. Now, at the distal convoluted tubule class, some little water is reabsorbed. Now, how does water reabsorption takes place here now? Principally, there are two ways involved. Number one, it is active pumping of sodium ions into the bloodstream to increase the concentration of the blood so that water can be reabsorbed back from the tubule into the bloodstream. Number two is by the secretion of the antidiuretic hormone. The antidiuretic hormone increases the permeability of the blood capillaries, and therefore they will be absorbing more blood, more water from the tubule into the blood. How? For example, when you take a lot of fluids, and therefore your body blood capillaries have a lot of water, that means you don't need to absorb more water from the kidney tubule. Rather, you want to, in fact, give out. And therefore, in such cases, the pituitary gland reduces the secretion of the antidiuretic hormone. And when the secretion of the antidiuretic hormone is lowered, what happens next? Less or little water is reabsorbed, and therefore more dilute urine is released. Again, what happens when there's little water in the body cells? Now, the pituitary gland responds by secreting more antidiuretic hormone. Now, if it secretes more antidiuretic hormone, that means the osmotic pressure of the blood capillaries will now be high. And once the osmotic pressure of the blood capillaries is high, that means a lot of water will be absorbed back from the kidney tubules into the blood stream, leading to the secretion of little concentrated urine. Now, class, the loop of Henle depends on the habitats, and therefore, depending on the habitat an organism lives, there is a structural modification that is subject to the habitat of the organism based on the loop of Henle. For instance, the desert organisms, they have longer loop of Henle simply because to increase the surface area of water reabsorption along the loop of Henle. Because in those habitats, there is a lack of water, and therefore these organisms have the tendency to conserve more water as opposed to the aquatic habitats where organisms are interested more in losing water than water retention. And therefore, now that filtrate now containing the urea, uric acid, and some water will be taken to the collecting tubule. It trickles down to the collecting tubule, and once it trickles down to the collecting tubule, it meets other it joins other collecting tubules from the other nephrons, and therefore that urine is trickled down as it passes through the ureter, urinary bladder, urethra, relaxation of the sphincter muscles, and finally released. And therefore, principally, class, that is basically about the kidney nephron and how urine formation and excretion takes place. Now, in summary class, what we are saying is here that the kidney has a basic functional unit called the kidney nephron, and the kidney nephron class basically does, it filters the blood, and we have the glomerulus, the proximal convoluted tubule, the distal convoluted tubule, the descending loop of Henle, ascending loop of Henle, collectively once loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, the collecting duct. And therefore, that is how the urine formation takes place, and that is how the structure and functions of the kidney nephron. Wish you all the best. With you here is teacher Muhyiddin Khalif will make your dreams realistic, valid, dive deep into our fascinating biology and mathematics lesson. Next lesson, stay tuned.